Welcome everybody to ACG's monthly meeting. We're blessed to have one of our board members, Rich Rhodes, who put this panel together a year ago, talk about kind of the same subject, but in a very different light, as probably like everybody else. The conversation recently in my world has been, when are we all getting back to normal? So in fact, I think every single conversation I've had this week has been around that. I'm Tim Myers. I'm the president of the ACG and I'm of the local chapter here, and I'm also with Baker Tilly. Like today, we've had some amazing sponsors through this whole COVID experience, and ACG's been very successful during this period where a lot of other not-for-profits have not, and it's because of the strength of our sponsors, of our members, and our board members that have been able to put together great programs like we're going to have today. And one of those board members, Rich Rhodes, is going to be leading today and going to be introducing our great panelists. But before he does so, I'm going to thank our sponsors that have carried us through the last, call it year and a half, through this COVID experience. Our platinum sponsors are BDO, Bernstein, Cressa, Greenberg Traurig, Lockton, Prospecta, and TD Bank. And our gold sponsors are Altamira Corporation, Bank of America, Cordia, Grant Thornton, Holland & Knight, and NFP. So with that, I'd love to introduce my friend and fellow board member, Rich Rhodes, who leads the local office of Cressa. And Rich, take it away.
Great, thanks, Tim. And good morning, everybody. Welcome. Just some housekeeping notes. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So if you have a question to ask and you go to the bottom of your screen, do not do it in chat, do it in Q&A, and we'll see it and we'll interweave your questions with our presentation or we'll bulk them up for the end and we'll address them then. So we would appreciate your input. Some of you were with us last year at this time where the pandemic was relatively new. We were just a few weeks in. And we were talking about things like sanitizing stations, social distancing, reserving seats to come back to work, not really knowing what the future held. Here we are a year later. Some things have changed, some things have not, but we've certainly been tracking the trends, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So you may recognize this panel, and we made one significant addition. So I am Rich Rhodes. I've been representing tenants in this region and beyond for the last 38 years. I'm one of the founding members of Cressa Global. My partner, Christy Minch, is on the line with us. Her specialty is workplace strategy and project management. We have both Holly Martin and Elizabeth Long from OTJ. They specialize in design, architecture, and just spatial issues in general. A lot of the trend analysis you'll see today comes from their research and their experience. And what I'll call our special guest today is Rhonda Esau, who is an attorney with Greenberg Traurig, who specializes in labor and employment law. So if you're like me, if you're a business owner, you're curious about what you can and can't do around getting employees back to work. So this should be very interesting, and let's get started.
Thanks, Rich, and good morning, everybody. So we just did a little snapshot of a year in review and what a roller coaster it has been. So I think we've all had a lot of mental, emotional gymnastics going on, not just at the workplace, but sort of all around. And so we tried to just capture in a fun way what we've all been thinking. So we started with the lockdown. We had this presentation shortly thereafter. We talked about how do we have that safe reentry? How many people can be there? How do we sanitize? And then, of course, we're all doing these presentations, and how many times have we heard, "You're on mute, you're on mute." I think there's probably been many t-shirts or sweatshirts made from that. And then we went through the whole mindset of, well, you know what, work from home is working. And maybe we're never going to go back. What purpose does the office space even serve anymore? And then we kept going along this path, and it was, wait a minute, now I want to go back, but how? And I think that's the big question where we are now, and how do we do it? And how do we find that balance? So the presentation today, we're really going to focus on what we're advising our clients to do and how we're helping them find that balance. And with
And
that,
now to
yeah, Rhonda, our guest here, and we have a couple of questions that we've received from a lot of our clients very frequently. So we put a couple of them up here, and Rhonda's going to go through those and how she's answering those for clients as well.
Thank you. So I think one of the main questions that's at the forefront of on a lot of our minds is, as an employer, can we require our employees to be vaccinated? So the EEOC came out with guidelines in December 2020 and answered the question, yes, with some exceptions. So the exceptions are, you have to give reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities, and then you also have to give accommodations to individuals who have sincerely held religious beliefs. But on top of that, there are some other warnings that companies have to take into consideration. There are some states that have enacted laws or are in the process of enacting legislation that will limit an employer's ability to mandate vaccinations. So right now, at least 10 states, including New York and Illinois, have pending legislation that will prohibit employers from requiring vaccines as a condition of employment, or will prohibit employers from terminating an employee for refusing the vaccine. And there are at least 10 states, including Pennsylvania, that have pending anti-discrimination laws that will prohibit employers from discriminating against an employee based on their COVID immunization status. So this area of the law is evolving rapidly. There are lots of moving parts and potential trouble spots for employers. So the trend that we're seeing at this time is that employers are highly encouraging employees to get vaccines rather than mandating them. That is the less risky approach in this area. We're also seeing some lawsuits filed by teachers and first responders who were required to get vaccines. So the less risky approach is definitely to encourage employees to get vaccines rather than mandating them. So the next question is, if vaccines are not mandatory, can employers offer an incentive to employees to encourage vaccinations? And the answer here is generally yes. So possible options include paid or unpaid time off to get the vaccine, modest incentives like gift cards, a group or department function upon achieving a certain number of vaccinations, things like that. You do have to keep in mind, though, that any additional compensation may be taxed. And then you also need to ensure that the incentive program does not run afoul of the ADA's prohibition. This is the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibition against a program, an incentive program, coercing employees to engage in a wellness program. So any type of incentive program, you need to make sure you're running that by your employment council to make sure it's complying with all the relevant laws. And then the EEOC also announced last week that it will issue guidance in this area, so employers will have more information to make sure that its programs are complying with the relevant laws. So that will be helpful as well. And then another question that a lot of employers are asking is, can employers ask employees if they've been vaccinated or require proof of vaccination? So the answer is yes. Generally, you can ask an employee if he or she has been vaccinated, because the answer to the question is generally going to be a yes or no. Because of the answer is going to generally be a yes or no, it's not going to elicit medical information from the employee. But you can't ask the follow-up question, why not? Because that response could elicit medical information from the employee. So that's the caveat there. You can ask the question, have they been vaccinated, but do not ask any follow-up questions if the answer is no. And then as far as proof of vaccination, you can ask for proof of vaccination. But when you do, make sure that you just say, we only need the dates of vaccination. We do not need any additional information. So you don't want the person to provide any medical information or family history information that could be on the vaccination card. And then if you do get the vaccination dates, keep it confidential as you would for any other medical information that you receive from an employee.
Rhonda, you read my mind there, because I was imagining talking with one of our teammates, as we have regularly, about the vaccination, and thinking that it's just a natural point in conversation to say, oh, great, well, why not? Or have you had trouble scheduling? Or to try and offer yourself as a resource to help them overcome whatever hurdle may have kept them from getting vaccinated at this point. But you're right, that could lead you into a very tangled discussion that you are not prepared to navigate.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I just want to remind everyone, I am manning the Q&A. So as things like that pop up, feel free to add them, and we'll try and address them and tap into Rhonda's knowledge beyond some of the questions that we've collected here today. We'll be weaving those in throughout the presentation. So in thinking about re-entering the office and finding that balance, as Christy talked us through in our opening sketch slide, we do a lot with our clients to help guide them, but there's also a lot of things I'm sure you all are doing with your employees to try and gauge what your future workplace should look like and how it should feel. There are a couple of key takeaways. This little graphic at the top is meant to organize you to a lot of different things you could do alongside workshops and ever-present surveys, which I know we're all leveraging the different survey tools out on the market quite regularly now. But the main takeaway is over-communicate, talk to everyone, do your best to try and tap into everyone's knowledge and their wants and their needs, and then weigh that against your leadership visioning, establish champions throughout the office to help you roll out change management, which Christy will talk on as we think about how to roll out some of these changes in the way that you're working. And then, bring in your resources, your architects, your trusted team of advisors within facilities, or your programming teammates, to start to look at different ways to assemble your programmatic requirements as you've heard from your staff. What type of meeting rooms do you need? If you are coming back into the office, what support spaces will make your staff comfortable? If you're leveraging a virtual first or a more remote focused work environment, what does that mean for your actual tangible office? Or what does that mean for your employees' home offices? And then always looking to the future and making sure that the buildings that you're looking at, alongside your brokerage team, your trusted advisors there, are really prepared and well-rounded to support your organization on how to be prepared for future issues that may come about that we haven't even anticipated yet, similar to this pandemic. But really smart technologies, infrastructural enhancements, just the way that a building runs itself is in this period of time is very telling for how they might help you through another moment in transition or a reimagined way of running your office.
And when we're looking at reimagining that, whether it's short-term or long-term, there's all kinds of considerations that we have to take into place when we're looking at this from a cost perspective and a timeline perspective. So really understanding your goals on when you want to return to the office and preparing ahead and in advance if you have to make any changes to your furniture, looking at the orientation of furniture, if you need to upgrade any technology, or simply make sure your technology is still working in your office. I know that's a big thing for our office. It was pretty dusty after a year of not really being used. And so we had to do a full tune-up and health check on that. What type of contractors or vendors do you need sort of in there and making some of these changes and adjustments? Design and engineering folks to take a look at, again, what's going on with our HVAC? Do we need to redesign anything? And then how are we changing our operating protocols? Are we, requiring masks? Where are we requiring masks? What are we doing in regards to occupancy in conference rooms and other sort of collaborative zones? So there's all kinds of things that go into this, but they also apply to that longer term strategy, right? As we're sort of trying to find that balance and we're starting to think about, okay, short term, we're going back, longer term, all of these same things apply. And with that, things are changing, right? And we are changing necessarily how we're occupying space. We're changing potentially how we use the space short term and in the future. So throughout that, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, communication is key, right? We have to communicate throughout that entire process. And depending on your level of change, sort of really tailor a communication plan to your employees to engage them and involve them throughout the process. So it's not a big shock when they do return to the office, and it's less of a mental hurdle to get there.
I'm going to pause us here and read a couple questions we just got, Christy. So for Rhonda, is it legally permissible to have our different policies and practices for employees that have the vaccine and those that do not? So can you kind of separate your policies amongst groups of people?
And for that question, I'm going to assume, well, I have to ask, is that pertaining to employees that are in the office or working remotely? I mean,
I would say so. There's a follow-up to that saying, can we have meetings for vaccinated people versus not? So if you think about that, right, are you allowing those in the office, to be vaccinated, requiring those in the office to be vaccinated, and then allowing those who are not to work from home? Can you separate policies accordingly? So,
right, and even requiring employees to be who are in the office to be vaccinated, you still have to remember that there are some states that are going to prohibit that. So you've got to be very careful in that area. So the advice we're giving clients is to not mandate vaccines. So if you have employees in the office, you still have to follow those CDC guidelines, social distancing, wearing masks, things of that nature. And even if people are vaccinated, the requirements are that you still follow those CDC guidelines when they're in workspaces. So I hope that answers the question.
So that, I think that ties into Joseph's question as well, Rhonda, which is, if we're saying we welcome you back into the office, but only if you're vaccinated, you can't say that. Is that correct? That would
be risky. And a lot of it too depends on which jurisdiction you're in. So we're not recommending to employers that they require vaccinations, because this is that gray area where we have never been before. So there is that risk of lawsuits in this area.
Rhonda, what about visitors? Can we require they be vaccinated to enter the office?
And that's another gray area too. And then we're not recommending that employers make that requirement either. Because if you're not going to require your employees to do it, how can you require that third parties be vaccinated as well? But same thing, follow CDC guidelines as far as mask wearing and social distancing.
But I think I was just going to ask really quick, legally, you can, right? Right now, except for in those couple of states that have that pending, but you are just recommending they don't because of inherent risks with lawsuits you're seeing pop up. Is that correct?
Well, and see, the thing is, it's evolving. So right now, it's 20 states that have pending legislation that are saying you can't mandate vaccines. And so we don't know if there are going to be more states that are going to do that as well. The EEOC guidelines say you can, unless the person has a disability or sincerely held religious belief. But because of the state laws that are, having restrictions on the ability to mandate vaccines, it's definitely a risky area. And then something else I didn't mention on top of that, the lawsuits that I mentioned where teachers and nurses, first responders who have filed these lawsuits, it's in the area of the emergency use authorization that the FDA has given to the vaccine. So under the FDA emergency use authorization, the idea is that the person choosing to get the vaccine is voluntary. They're given a disclosure that says you have the option to get the vaccine. So they filed a lawsuit saying, hey, this is not voluntary. They're requiring that I get it. Arguably when the vaccines get the license under the FDA regulations, that argument goes away. But right now they're using that argument under the FDA guidelines to say you can't not mandate the vaccine. Those FDA guidelines have not been applied to private employers, but that's not to say it won't be. And as an aside, the Department of Defense is not requiring that service members get the vaccine. So this is just an evolving area. So it's an area, because of the fact that it's evolving and there's so many moving parts, and state legislatures are enacting new laws or trying to pass new laws, that we are just not recommending that employers take that hard stance and say we are requiring vaccinations.
So I want to follow on here.
It's just too risky.
A little, Rhonda. So Joseph, who has offices in DC and New York, says staff can work from home. No one has to come into the office, but if they want to, they need to be vaccinated. So is that soft enough language to say, while we've given you the ability to work from home, everyone, if you would like to come into the office, we do require that you're vaccinated. Again, there's that require word. Is that too tricky as well?
Well, right now he says New York. New York has that pending legislation. So, he's going to have to watch that legislation in New York. For now, they're probably okay. But New York also has legislation, and this is, I think, what we're going to get to on the next slide, that if they're saying if you're going to go to the office, you have to get vaccinated, they're going to have to pay them for the time to get the vaccine.
Right. It seems like gentle guidelines or recommendations feel better than mandates in this moment. Going back to that communication piece, while we understand everyone has the opportunity to choose, we for the benefit of your colleagues, we would welcome everyone make the option to be vaccinated to create a safe environment. However, we still will be practicing CDC protocols of social distancing and masks. And to further our commitment to a safe environment, we will ask FedEx delivery individuals and so on to leave packages in the lobby and ask our front desk person to go bring them up. Back to Rich's comment about guests and others who we may not have as much control over.
Correct.
It's kind of a soft policy that really strongly encourages everyone to create a really safe office environment.
That's correct.
Okay.
All right. And another thing to bring up too is, if an employee raises a safety concern, another potential risk for an employer, if the person says, I don't want to take the vaccine because I don't know that it's safe, there's a chance under the workplace safety guidelines, OSHA, the person can say, hey, if you say that I have to take the vaccine, you're retaliating against me because I refuse to take the vaccine. So that's another risk too. We haven't seen any of those cases yet, but that's the possibility.
Okay. That's a good segue, Holly, into kind of the way the office feels, right? And kind of the overall impression.
Right. So with the information that we're able to collect through the process that Elizabeth elaborated on a couple of slides ago, talking to leadership and doing discovery workshops with your staff and through the survey results, we're able to imagine what the future workplace may look like, and it may be different than what it looked like in the past. So we want to really focus on the activities that are being done in the office versus the home office, and supporting the experience in the office to fill in the gaps of the parts and pieces that we're hearing from most, if not all, of our clients that are missing, related to mentorship, socialization, and generally the feeling of community. So the sketches represented here on the screen are some kind of thought starters about what that future office may look like in a lot of cases. And there's another piece to this as well. related to kind of emotional motivation and connection to the organization and engagement overall. You can imagine that, some may be lacking entry-level interns. People who've never been in the office in general don't have quite the connection with their colleagues that many of us do as we kind of look back and reflect on some of our favorite moments in the office, or a great brainstorming session where a big idea came out that wasn't particularly planned. So we're really focused on sort of filling in the gap of the hybrid work model to better support each individual in the organization as a whole. And we've been surveying our clients, as you can imagine, throughout the entire pandemic. So the numbers represented here on the screen are recent averages of what we're hearing. The numbers kind of fluctuated as represented in the graph that Christy spoke to about how we were all feeling. But by and large, about 45% of our clients are expecting to work from home 3+ days a week, but that still leaves some room for the office to kind of fill in the gaps there. So we're optimistic about the return to the office and what it can do for each of us. And many folks, as we start to talk about seat sharing and in order to gain efficiencies of the real estate overall, but also to protect the energetic nature of the office, we ask about the idea of giving up an assigned seat in exchange for the ideal remote work schedule. And most people are accepting of it. And what this does is allows people to share desks or reserve desks with the confidence that they've been sanitized, but also a variety of other spaces to go work within the office too. So it starts to feel more dynamic and not so siloed against just workspaces and meeting spaces. So Rhonda, back to you and all the good stuff of the presentation here. I think we're all really enjoying your remarks here. Even I'm taking notes, even after all our preps. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about these questions on the screen as well.
Sure. So we've talked about this a little bit, but are employers required to pay employees for time being vaccinated? So the answer is it depends. It depends on where the employer is located. New York recently passed a law that requires private employers to pay its employees for time spent to get the vaccine. Other states, including California and Illinois, have issued guidance indicating that employers should pay employees for time spent getting the vaccine if they require it. Also, as a general rule, if the employer mandates the vaccine, it should pay for the time getting the vaccine. If the employer recommends but does not mandate the vaccine, the employer is not required to compensate the employee for the time, for the off-duty time spent getting the vaccine. The next question, can we require people back in the office, assuming we're following CDC jurisdictional guidelines? This is a question we're getting a lot. And the answer is generally yes, but employers may have to make accommodations for employees with medical conditions. And
Rhonda, before you go on, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday in our prep.
Sure.
If we require people back in the office and someone wants to work from home, pre-pandemic, if someone didn't come to the office, you could make a case that they should be terminated. How about now?
It's probably a little more difficult now. And what I always ask, my employers, especially now, my clients, is if the person you're talking about, let's say you're in a situation, you want to terminate someone, but what if it's your top employee? What if it's your 10 top employees and you want to let them go because they don't want to return right now because they don't feel it's safe? Are you really going to do that?
Yeah, not feel it's safe. What if the comment is, I live an hour and a half away. I've really gotten used to not commuting. I don't have to get on the metro. I'm going to work from home.
Right. And then I think at that point, the employer, do you want to talk about some flexibility options, especially if, if these are your top folks, do you want to talk about maybe a hybrid schedule, or some flexible option instead of a rigid, if you don't come back, you're terminated. I think that's what most employers are doing right now, is trying to come up with something, in the middle. Can we, because we might not want everyone back in the office 100% right now. Do we have the ability to have everyone socially distanced in the office? Is it better to have, some sort of hybrid model right now? Is that the better approach, and to continue to have some sort of flexibility? And I think that's what most employers right now are trying to do, is have some flexibility in this area.
So Rhonda, I want to go back to Jenny's question from before that we talked a little bit about, but I'm going to ask it again. I know you addressed a lot of this, but is it legally permissible to have different policies and practices for employees that have vaccines and those do not? And can we have meetings for vaccinated people versus not? So could you say, we're going to host a meeting in the office today. There's remote connectivity for those who are not vaccinated, but those who are, we welcome you to join us in person, or we strongly encourage you to join us in person. So thinking a little bit about, we're still practicing CDC guidelines in the office. So someone who's not vaccinated can say, hey, I want to come to that meeting, but you would say, we'd rather you not, because we want to create a safe environment. Like, is that getting discriminatory in that? I'm not sure.
No, I mean, I think that's fine, because you are making sure you have a safe environment for the folks that are there in the office. But even the folks that are there in the office, most likely they would still most likely wear their mask, even if unless you're going to ask for proof of vaccination for those folks that are there. I would still recommend, social distance, and even within the conference room space, and have masks on, unless you do have proof of vaccination.
Right. Jenny's got a follow on. Can we have certain protocols and requirements for staff travel for those who are vaccinated, and a different set of protocol requirements for staff travel for those who are not? So, if we're all previously traveling and now we say, okay, we only want those of you who are vaccinated to travel because we feel safer, is that allowed?
And that would be consistent with CDC guidelines, because CDC guidelines are different for travel guidelines are different for people who are vaccinated versus those who are not vaccinated. So that would be consistent with CDC guidelines.
Good. So pairing that up with the guidelines, that's a good tip there. We have an anonymous question, and can we ask staff via survey if they intend to get vaccinated? And I assume if the responses are anonymous, we can ask that, but if they're not anonymous responses, then that might be a little tricky, or is that allowed either way?
You can ask an employee if they intend to get vaccinated. That's permissible. And I would prefer it to be anonymous. I think that's a better approach.
So you're getting a percentage, 85% of our employees intend to get vaccinated. And then maybe you go back and you can ask if they did or they didn't, but you're not tying it to who Correct. They are. So you can't discriminate against them. It's anonymous surveys.
But it's not, right. I believe it's not required to be anonymous, right? I just want to be clear on sort of what you can.
It's not required. Yeah. It's not required to be anonymous, but I like that approach of it being anonymous. So that way there's no demographic information there that you're keeping.
And I think you and Rich covered earlier, can a person remain home under a required back to office scenario? And I guess you required is that word again, right? Like, can you require back to office?
I mean, technically under the current, if you say everyone's got to come back to the office and you're adhering to CDC guidelines, then you still have to go through the analysis of whether or not the person is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or there's any other accommodation you have to give the person. So you do have to go through that analysis. And then if the person says, I don't feel that the office is safe, then you still have the concern of, is the person saying, I don't feel safe. And then if you terminate the person, you terminated the person because they felt it was an unsafe work environment, and then there's a potential OSHA retaliation claim. So you still have the same concerns. So, you know, it's an area where, you know, we're still in some uncharted territory. So I think you have to be careful going to the nuclear option of termination. But that would be something I would definitely discuss with employment counsel before terminating.
Right.
Because
right.
there are certain things steps you have to go through before you go to the termination option, to make sure you've covered certain areas, to make sure that you've looked at it, whether or not an accommodation of work from home is viable, and some other areas you need to cover as well.
Perhaps a shift in role could be something to accommodate that, right? If we feel the role really requires an in-person presence, or, you know, travel or something that they're not, you know, willing to get vaccinated for, then a change in role might be something to pursue.
Correct.
Can we ask
And
someone?
you have to remember, because people have been working from home for all this time, it's going to be a little more difficult for employers to say the work from home option is not feasible.
Right. The performance metrics have to be kind of closely tracked in that case, to say that your performance at home is not as exemplary or as equivalent to your performance previously conducted in the office, and then take into consideration outside variables that could contribute to that.
Correct.
Two more questions. Can we ask someone when hiring them if they are vaccinated? I think you touched on that before, but I don't recall what the response.
It's the same. You can ask them if they've been vaccinated. Yes.
Okay. Yes or no question, right? But don't let it lead into, well, why not? If someone doesn't come back to the office due to safety concerns, yet you find out they participate in personal travel and other public activities, this is a good question, Matt. Do you have a stronger case into mandating office attendance? So if you see that they're traveling and going to restaurants and doing other things, but they refuse to come into the office, how does that work?
You do have a stronger case at that point to mandate it.
So building.
But you have to be careful, because you have a stronger case to argue mandating it at that point. But of course, you know, you have to make sure you're being consistent, that you're tracking all your employees the same way. And so there's no disparate treatment as to how you're treating this employee versus other employees.
Rhonda, you realize you're creating a monster for yourself right now, right?
Excellent. All right, that's all the questions from the team right now.
Okay.
All right, so this slide is a snapshot of an analysis we performed with one of our clients, and it's just meant to share with y'all different ways of looking at your real estate. And Rich will deep dive into this a little bit more later in the presentation. But if you're thinking about where we were previously, this is, you know, kind of your baseline. You've got a whole floor, you're using one-to-one, everyone's got their own desk, anticipating coming in every single day, as many of us were. And then we're starting to study those sharing ratios in that unassigned seating model. And we recognize, and we're very thoughtful about this when we go through those exercises that we highlighted earlier, and thinking through, you know, one size doesn't fit all within most organizations. So your teams may have different sharing models that give you a kind of a blended approach. But if you start to think 2 people to every 1 seat, generally, what we want you to take away is that it's a 50% occupancy, but not 50% of your square footage necessarily, because you may need more support spaces. You may need a different makeup of space to kind of take you through that transition. And then as you go to a more aggressive or forward-leaning 3-to-1, which many of our international corporate clients have been doing for years now, you're not quite at a 50% square footage, because you're finding that comfort capacity and you're infusing all those kind of cultural promoting spaces into your footprint. So it's not just as simple as slice it in half, slice it into a third. It becomes a little bit more dynamic for that. But you know, when you're thinking about it thoughtfully, you can weave in ways to expand into this if this model doesn't work, or perhaps, you know, reduce further if it is really working and you want to step up to that more aggressive ratio.
So another layer of thinking about kind of reoccupying the office is who's in when. So you've kind of, let's imagine we've determined how much square footage we're taking and kind of what that future design looks like. But now what? How do we get back in there? And how do we organize teams to reoccupy to the benefit of the team and the organization as a whole? So this also even applies to just reentering in general right now. So one approach would be kind of this A-B day situation. Maybe it's very structured. Every other seat is occupied each day. So there's simplicity in planning there. You get to maintain that assigned seating. There's no overarching concern about the sharing germ spread of the desk itself. You're able to ensure the distancing between people. People feel more comfortable with that. But that may start to break down teams. Imagining that a team sat near each other pre-pandemic. So if you take half of the team and put them remote and half in the office, you always have a hybrid model. So you may never get the benefit of a whole team being together to come up with that next big idea. So another way to think of it is what we've titled here is consistent pods. So let's look at the Monday category where we've got the yellow, blue, and green dots. So let's imagine that that's 3 different departments: finance, marketing, and HR, let's say. And those groups work so closely together that it is to their benefit to always be together. So their days are Mondays and Thursdays. But different teams come in on Tuesdays and Fridays. That has a lot of benefit in terms of team continuity, immediate team continuity, but it causes some concern around, well, internal networking or sort of just that cross-sectional collaboration with people outside of your team. And some of the osmotic learning, you're just hearing other people talk about different things and it sparks an idea for you. And a third idea to think about here is what we've titled revolving pods. So maybe you're always in the office with your immediate team, but it varies each week what other teams you're with. So it's a bit more of a dynamic model, no doubt a little more challenging to coordinate and monitor, but you may get a lot of benefit from that depending on how your organization works. And then I'll mention too here that the Friday food and fun, we've done a lot of speculating about the future of Fridays and wondering if anybody would ever choose to be in the office on a Friday. It may become more of a ghost town, perhaps, depending on the requirements otherwise. But that kind of leads to a quote unquote 4-day work week in the office, but maybe there's an event monthly or quarterly or even weekly to be in the office, everybody in the office, or maybe it varies every other week so that you can control the overall density, but to really get that social engagement piece back that was naturally happening in pre-pandemic, at the coffee machine or just in the cafe in the morning or at lunchtime.
And so consistent with one of our previous slides when we just talked about what are all the things that we need to do with our protocols and policies to support this. So when we start to look at any level of unassigned seating or different shifts and days that people are in, we really have to look at how do we support that and how do we make it safe and comfortable for everyone. I think one of the biggest hurdles that people were struggling with a year ago, especially, was just, well, if we go back and if we go to any sort of, model where people can select desks, it's not the same desk every day. We're all very worried about the cleanliness of it, right? So developing those policies to have really a clean desk policy so that it can be sanitized, whether by individuals coming to occupy that desk or whether by the janitorial staff at the building. If it's not a clean desk, they won't clean it. So I think that's an important policy when you're looking at this type of model. And then there's personal storage. So a lot of people are like, I can't have my pictures and my files and things like that at my desk all the time. What am I going to do? So there's a number of different ways to do this with different personal storage units or lockers or long-term storage, whatever that might be, but having it assigned to an individual so they know where they can go and put their things when they are in the office. And then a work setup, having it be standardized throughout. And I think also in a lot of these collaboration rooms that we're looking at, so in these more dynamic office models that Elizabeth and Holly were talking about, there are going to be all different kinds of collaboration spaces, heads down spaces, and to the extent you can have technology standardized throughout and make it easy for people to get up and plug in different places, it's just going to be a much more efficient and productive day. And I think the same goes with home, right? If we're thinking of the office space now as more of an ecosystem of spaces where you've got the office, you've got your home, or you've got your other location where you have Wi-Fi, having that standardized technology as much as possible is just going to make everything easier and better for the user. And then, the technology to manage this. So there are all different kinds of technologies coming up to reserve seats and space utilization softwares. They are becoming more robust by the day to include things like wellness checks. So before you can reserve a seat at your office space, you have to sort of take that wellness check survey that CDC or OSHA recommends. You know, I don't have a fever, I don't have symptoms, etc. And then you can book a seat. But there are so many different ones, and it can be overwhelming. Which one is right for me? How does it align with our workforce strategy and our workplace strategy? And so what we've done is we've started to demo a lot of these different software solutions and sort of just come up with what do they have, what do they offer, how are they different? And then we're using that to guide our clients through these discussions as well, and making sure that what we're potentially suggesting aligns again with that workforce and workplace strategy. And then we can set up demos as well.
So let's tie this all up in a bow a little bit with this last question here too, and get to Rich's very informative slide. What we don't want to lose sight of, right? This is a well-rounded evaluation that we're trying to encourage everyone embark upon as they're thinking about their future office. Think about, you know, who needs to be in the office, at what ratio can they share? What does this mean for a potential reduction of space? And then don't forget about growth, right? So, you know, these diagonal lines here tracking across the chart that you see, this is kind of a complicated chart that we assembled for a client of ours who mandated virtual first is the way of the future for us. Everything needs to be set up to be participated in virtually. However, we have a strong culture and we've always leaned heavily on our offices to support that culture. So we don't want to lose sight of that. So what does that mean in a good balance, right? How much space do we need to accommodate, again, tracking the survey data throughout the pandemic and going forward, the amount of time people want to be in the office, what groups want to be in with which groups, what critical adjacencies need to be maintained so that there's kind of, you know, a little bit of extra square footage there to accommodate that and make sure we're meeting as many folks' needs as possible. And then we're allowing for growth. So finding that sweet spot, and we don't want to get out too far over our skis, so to speak, as we might have historically for a 10-year, a 12-year deal. You know, just getting to 2026 feels like the right amount of time to look at for this particular group because they had their best year yet last year, which is unexpected. They're growing rapidly, but they want to balance all of these different, you know, kind of like we said, aspirations of leadership alongside their growth and hit that sweet spot. So that takes us somewhere in 55% of what they have now, which is a huge reduction, and just reimagining that into something that gives them flexibility and allows them to keep growing and perhaps keep reducing with stronger desk sharing ratios and smart use of technology to be able to use the space to its fullest. So yeah. Rich, before you go on, the performance metrics question is a really good one here for Rhonda before we move forward. As performance metrics are evolving, right, as we get back into the office, how can we communicate that if someone was previously performing in the work from home environment, but now we're seeing a new definition of what performing means? How are we able to hold them accountable for that if they are, you know, still working from home and perhaps not keeping up with our new performance criteria? And is there a way to navigate that?
I think you just need to have those discussions with the employee about what their expectations are and the clear lines of communication just to make sure the employee is aware of what the expectations are, and have the written documentation to make sure that the employee is aware that the expectations are not being met. So you have that proof if you need it. If you need to go to termination, you have the backup documentation to substantiate it.
Yeah, I want to add just something really interesting. One of my clients said the other day in regards to performance, and I think that ties into what you're saying, Rhonda, is that we've all of us have been working from home for over a year. So performance metrics should no longer be about whether or not you're in the office or whether or not you're working from home. We've all realized and proved to be able to do this for over a year that we can work productively at home. So a performance issue is just a performance issue, no matter if you're at home or if you're at the office. We know you can work from home. So if you're not, or if you're not performing in the office, either way, that employee is having a performance issue and it needs to be documented, like Rhonda said, and then addressed sort of that way, kind of no matter where they work, which I thought was really interesting and just a little bit of a mind shift since, we're thinking about returning to the office and we're all sort of thinking about how we used to work for so many years. So just super thought from a client that I thought was really interesting.
And I'll add.
And I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just from my world. The worst thing is when you get involved in a case, you get the call about the performance issue, and the first question I ask is, "What was the last performance review? Where's the documentation?" And the answer is, "I don't have it." So you always have to document those performance issues because it makes my job easier if I have something to show that says, "Hey, here's the email, here's the performance review," to show that the performance issues were documented. So even if the person is working from home, you still can have that email to say, "Hey, here are the 10 things you haven't done," or "I emailed you 5 times during the day and you didn't write back." I mean, you still can document the performance issues. Sorry, Rich.
Great. No, that's okay. Thanks, Rhonda. So just to comment on this graph, and this is a real life scenario. This is a tenant that OTJ and Cresa have in common at the moment. Their lease expires in 2026, but here we are in 2021 doing this work now. It will lead into my next slide on around the softness of the market and what tenants are able to do at the moment. But this tenant has 115,000 feet. They've gone virtual first, as Elizabeth said. That does not mean that their employees don't come to work. There's a fair percentage of their employees who want to come to work, but under what culture, right? Some of the previous slides talked about. The bottom line is we've evaluated that we can get done what they need done in under 78,000 square feet. That's a significant reduction. And by the way, that was not their intention. They didn't come to this process saying, "I want to reduce my square footage. I just want to reduce the way we work." And that amounted to less space. So we're about to enter negotiations with the landlord 5 years in advance of our lease expiration date, which leads me to the next slide. So we are in a soft market. That should come as no surprise to anyone. But there are 3 basic reasons for that. Number one, since March of 2020, over 1 million square feet each of sublease space has been added to the market in DC and Virginia, and about half that amount in Maryland. Number 2, tenants are coming back. They're looking around. Perhaps their leases are expiring, and they're finding out what the client in that graph is finding out. We don't need as much space. And number 3, there's the unknown of what the future holds. All of that is concern and competition for landlords. And when that happens, you're in a soft market. And we've seen this in the past. You go back to the early 90s, the savings and loan crisis, 2000, the dot-com bust, 9/11, the Great Recession in 2008, locally sequestration in 2013, and all markets seem to follow the same pattern. This one is just different in one aspect. We have not yet seen downward pressure on rents. If you ask me, I think it's coming. I don't think everybody's back to work yet. We haven't seen that space jettisoned yet. So I believe that's coming. But in the meantime, all of these things are on the table. And there are qualifiers, right? Different landlords, different size tenants have different leverage points. But generally speaking, we are negotiating a number of leases several years early now. So the takeaway on that is I would not be concerned with your lease expiration date. If you're thinking about reimagining your office, or if you're over market, it is something we can look at regardless. Concession packages, even though there's not significant downward pressure on rents, concession packages are way up. Tenant improvement allowances are way up. Rental rate is way up. You know, it costs more to move, by the way, than it ever has before. So that's another reason why renegotiations are popular right now. Length of the lease, you used to need to do 10 or 15 years to achieve some of the concessions I'm referring to. I've seen some amazing deals on 7 and 8 year leases that I never would have imagined a year ago. Flexibility, everything we're talking about has a massive unknown factor. Even that 78,000 feet that our client is going to take, is that a good number in 2026? We may not know till 2026. So we are successfully negotiating options to get out of leases along the way, ability to contract during the term, ability to expand during the term, of course, the option to extend and sublease rights. Operating expenses, what's in, what's out. All these buildings are adding COVID and pandemic protection into their HVAC systems, their elevators, their building security. What is an allowable pass-through to a tenant and what is not? This is the first time we're going to see this. If you had a 2016 base year and the landlord loads all the expenses into 2021, is this massive increase in operating expenses going to be an allowable pass-through? So we have a lease audit division that evaluates all that, but they are busy. I can tell you that right now. And then other points, as you might expect, I didn't cover all the economics, but of course, security deposits. I mean, don't assume that's set in stone. These are negotiable items. Other economics, escalations, caps on operating expenses, force majeure. Who's responsible if your construction is interrupted due to a positive test? Or what happens during the term if we hit another pandemic? Do we get rental abatement? These are things we can now, we understand and we can pre-negotiate. And then audit rights, that has to do with operating expenses, the ability to dig into the landlord's books and make sure what's being passed through is proper. So just, you know, a few of tens of dozens of items that are currently on the table. I know we're running out of time, team, so we only have a couple of minutes, but this is a good sign. We're done. Christy?
Yeah, no, just to sort of summarize everything we went through and what are some of the big takeaways. We think first and most importantly, just to continue to actively communicate with your leadership team, with employees, give yourself flexibility with your policies and make sure managing expectations across the board is super important. Strategizing, let's take advantage of this opportunity to reduce your real estate costs. There's a lot of opportunity here that I think is important to at least take a look at and see what your options are. And then lean in for some help between employment counsel or real estate strategy team or architects, you know, any of us really, and anyone that you work with is important that you lean on for just help throughout this. We're all navigating it together. This is something none of us have done before. So I think it's important that we remember it takes a village. So those are sort of our big takeaways from today, and really appreciate you all being here, and we'll open it up for a minute of Q&A. And if we don't get to everything, we can certainly try to address it in a follow-up email.
We've got one more question here, Rich. This is towards you. A government contracting client of mine executed a 10-year lease in Tyson's in January 2020. What would be a reasonable buyout to exit the lease?
Oh, I mean, there are so many factors that go into that. You know, in the purest sense, I'm sure the landlord is not prepared to give up 100% of that revenue. So on the other hand, we've got a landlord who's approached us who wants a tenant space back. So those leverage points are clearly different. The sublease market is very active right now. Tenants who don't want to spend a lot of money on furniture and construction are doing fairly well getting rid of their space. So I'm hesitant to answer that. That's a complicated question without seeing the lease, but these are things we can talk about. All right, it's 10 o'clock. Let me let everybody know that next week's meeting is our annual social. It's a wine education seminar. It'll be from 5 to 7. It's virtual. you'll have the ability to pick up wine or have wine delivered, and that information will come out sometime today. So look for that. And I think that is it. I want to thank the panel, all friends and colleagues, and being on ACG, I'm glad I can call on you for the second time. Reserve this time next year, please. We'll probably do it again. Back to you, Tim. That's all we got.
Thanks, everybody. And I think you all did a fantastic job. Thank you so much. And updating the information, Rhonda, I mean, the laws that they're changing as quickly as I think you can tell us about them. But thank you for all your help there. And we look forward to seeing everyone next week at the wine event. Have a great day.